Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed something unsettling right away. My name tag didn't show my name at all. Instead, it read that I was the old woman paying for everything. I'm truly glad you're here, and I'd like you to stay with me until the end. Feel free to share the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story reaches. I have always believed that family celebrations are meant to be joyful occasions. My granddaughter Laura's wedding was supposed to be one of those perfect days. The kind that warms your heart every time you think back on it. Instead, it became the moment I realized how my family truly saw me. On the morning of the wedding, I spent more time than usual getting ready. At 65, I am not particularly vain, but I still wanted to look my best. I chose a pale blue dress that my late husband Thomas had always loved. I carefully styled my silver hair and added a light touch of the perfume he had given me for our last anniversary before cancer took him 3 years ago. Looking at my reflection, I quietly reassured myself that I looked beautiful, imagining Thomas saying those words. For a moment, it almost felt as though I could hear his voice and sense his presence beside me. The ceremony at St. Stephen's Church was lovely. Laura looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, her face glowing with happiness. My son Charles stood proudly as he escorted her, and even my daughter-in-law Diane appeared sincerely emotional. For a short while, everything felt exactly right. Everything changed at the reception. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel and made my way to the check-in table, where guests were picking up their name tags and table assignments. A young woman standing there smiled as she searched through the alphabetized cards before handing one to me, politely addressing me as Mrs. Holloway. When I looked down, I expected to see my name, Margaret Holloway, grandmother of the bride. Instead, written in elegant calligraphy, were the words describing me as the old woman who would pay for everything. My hand froze midair as I stared at it, thinking there must have been some mistake. The young woman noticed my reaction and gently asked whether something was wrong. I forced a polite smile and explained that there seemed to be an issue with my name tag. She leaned closer to look, her eyes widening with concern, and offered to check if there was another one. Not wanting to cause a scene at Laura's wedding, I quickly told her it was fine and that I would speak with my family about it instead. I pinned the offensive tag to my dress and walked into the ballroom, my cheeks burning with humiliation. Questions kept running through my mind. Had Laura approved this, or was it Charles and Diane who thought something like this was appropriate, or even amusing? During the cocktail hour, I tried to act as though nothing was wrong, making polite conversation with other guests. Some did not notice the tag, while others were likely too polite to mention it. Then I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Someone quietly laughed while mentioning the grandmother's name tag, adding that Diane thought it was hilarious. Another voice followed, remarking that I was apparently seen as their personal source of money. I moved away quickly, my hands shaking. Just then, Charles noticed me and called me over, his voice carrying across the room as he invited me to meet a group of well-dressed guests, mentioning that one of them used to golf with Thomas. I approached reluctantly, recognizing the man as someone who had likely been one of Thomas's business associates. Charles introduced me to Frank and Helen Whitaker, but then with a laugh referred to me as the family's walking bank account. Helen's smile faltered as she glanced at my name tag, and Frank looked visibly uncomfortable. I straightened myself and introduced who I truly was, making it clear that I was Thomas's widow. Frank responded kindly, recalling that Thomas had spoken of me often and with pride. The conversation continued, but I barely heard any of it. When the Whitakers moved on, I pulled Charles aside and pointed to my name tag, asking him what it was supposed to mean. He laughed it off, telling me not to be so sensitive and insisting that it was just a joke, reminding me that everyone knew I was the one with the deep pockets since my husband had left everything to me. I told him in a quiet voice that the situation felt deeply humiliating, trying to stay composed despite everything. Charles reacted dismissively, rolling his eyes and brushing it off, saying I should stop taking it so seriously and simply enjoy the celebration since it was meant to be a party. Before I had a chance to respond, Diane approached us, looking elegant in her mother-of-the-bride dress. She greeted me warmly and asked whether Charles had already introduced me to the guests, adding with a playful tone that they wanted everyone to know who was responsible for such a beautiful wedding. She gave a quick wink, and the two of them shared a laugh. Feeling overwhelmed, I excused myself and went to the restroom, needing a moment alone. As I stood there gently dabbing at my eyes with a tissue, the door opened. An older gentleman in a well-tailored suit stepped in briefly, then quickly backed out, apologizing for the mistake. From outside, he called my name carefully, identifying himself as Gregory Caldwell, Thomas's attorney, and asking if he could speak with me for a moment. I gathered myself and stepped out. Gregory had handled Thomas's estate and had always treated me with kindness. His gaze shifted briefly toward my name tag, clearly aware of what had been said about me. I let out a small sigh and explained that it had all been dismissed as some sort of joke. His expression immediately darkened, making it clear that he did not find it amusing at all and that Thomas certainly would not have either. After a brief pause, he lowered his voice and explained that there was something important I needed to know, something Thomas had insisted should remain undisclosed unless it became absolutely necessary. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an envelope, explaining that it contained an addition to Thomas's will, made shortly before he passed away. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read. The legal language was complex, but the meaning was unmistakable. Any descendant who publicly humiliated me would lose their inheritance from Thomas's fortune, a fortune far greater than I had ever imagined. I looked up at Gregory, stunned, and asked why Thomas had never told me about this. Gregory explained quietly that Thomas had hoped it would never need to be used, as he wanted the family to treat me well out of love, not fear of losing what they stood to inherit. I glanced back toward the ballroom, where my family continued celebrating, completely unaware that their behavior had just cost them millions. Gregory asked what I intended to do next. After a moment of thought, I carefully folded the document and handed it back to him, explaining that I did not want to act yet, as I needed to see how far they would go. When I returned to the reception, the name tag still rested against my chest, but it no longer brought only shame. Instead, something else had begun to take its place. A growing determination to finally see my family for who they truly were. The morning after Laura's wedding, I sat alone at my kitchen table, still wearing my bathrobe, staring at the offensive name tag I had placed in front of me. The elegant calligraphy now felt mocking, repeating the same cruel message about being the one expected to pay for everything. I traced the letters slowly with my fingertip, thinking about how Thomas would have reacted if he had seen it. He was not a man who lost his temper easily, but when someone disrespected those he loved, his anger was unmistakable. I quietly reflected that perhaps they had changed, or maybe they had always been this way and we had simply chosen not to see it. Drawn by memory, I walked into the living room and looked at the large family portrait above the fireplace. It had been taken 5 years earlier, on our 40th anniversary. Thomas sat in the center, still strong despite the early signs of the illness that would later take him. I stood beside him, my hand resting on his shoulder. Charles and Diane stood on either side, while Laura and her brother Daniel, still teenagers at the time, stood in front. We looked happy, we looked like a real family. As I stood there, I found myself wondering when everything had begun to change. The question stayed with me as I prepared my morning tea. Perhaps it had happened gradually, so slowly that I had not noticed the loss of respect until it was already too late. The first clear memory came just 6 months after Thomas's funeral. Charles and Diane had invited me to dinner, which was unusual even then. That evening they had been especially attentive, asking about how I was doing and reminiscing about Thomas. Then during dessert, the true purpose of the evening became clear. Charles began explaining that they had been thinking about remodeling their kitchen, mentioning simple updates like new appliances and countertops. I responded kindly, thinking it sounded like a pleasant plan, not realizing what was coming next. Diane then added in a smooth and careful tone that with college tuition for the children and other expenses, they were feeling financially stretched. I remembered the pause that followed, the expectant way they both looked at me. When I asked if they were requesting money, Charles quickly clarified that it was not exactly a request, but more of an assumption that I might want to help the family, especially since Thomas had left me financially comfortable. That same evening, I wrote them a check for $30,000. Looking back, that was where it all began. Small requests gradually grew into much larger ones. A simple kitchen remodel turned into a complete home renovation. Help with tuition evolved into luxury cars for both Laura and Daniel when they turned 18. Family vacations, which I was invited to attend, also became trips I was expected to pay for. I went to the hallway closet and took out a box filled with financial records. Sitting on the floor, I began going through bank statements and canceled checks one by one. The evidence of how much I had supported Charles and Diane's lifestyle was overwhelming. Over 3 years, I had given them nearly $250,000. The phone rang, cutting through my counting. It was Diane. She asked if I was home and said she had been trying to reach me on my cell phone. I hadn't even realized my phone was still in my evening purse. I answered that I was home and asked if everything was all right. She quickly reassured me that everything was fine, explaining that she and Charles simply wanted to thank me for everything from yesterday, adding that the wedding had been beautiful. I agreed that it really had been lovely. She went on to say that Laura and Stephen were very grateful for my generosity, and that they could not have had such a wonderful wedding without me. I closed my eyes, remembering the $45,000 check I had written for the venue and catering, and said that I was happy to help. She then added that this was actually part of the reason for her call, her voice taking on that overly sweet tone I had come to recognize. She explained that Stephen's parents were supposed to pay for the honeymoon, but his father's business had been struggling, so they had to back out, and Laura was very upset. I could already sense what was coming next. She said they were wondering if I might be able to help, explaining that Laura and Stephen had their hearts set on 2 weeks in Bali. She mentioned that she and Charles would contribute as well, though I knew that almost all of the wedding expenses had been covered by me. I replied that I would think about it, which surprised both of us with how non-committal it sounded. There was a short pause before she said they needed to book soon to get the best rates. I told her I understood and that I would let her know tomorrow. After hanging up, I returned to what felt like financial archaeology. Thomas had always warned me about Charles's relationship with money. He once told me that Charles saw money as the solution to everything, but that money without values only created more problems. I hadn't understood it then, or perhaps I hadn't wanted to. A knock at the door startled me. Through the peephole, I saw my grandson Daniel standing outside, shifting nervously on the porch. I quickly gathered the scattered financial papers and put them back into the closet before opening the door. He greeted me and stepped forward to hug me. At 21, he was tall like his grandfather, with the same kind eyes. He asked if I was okay, and mentioned that he had been texting me. I told him I was fine, just a bit tired after yesterday, and invited him inside. He followed me into the kitchen, where I put the kettle on for fresh tea. Daniel had always been different from the rest of them, more thoughtful and less focused on appearances and status. Sitting at the table, he said he wanted to apologize for what had happened yesterday, mentioning the name tag and the way people had been talking, saying it wasn't right. I felt a lump in my throat and asked if he had noticed. He replied that of course he had noticed, and that many others had noticed as well. He lowered his gaze, clearly embarrassed, and admitted that he felt he should have spoken up. I gently patted his hand and told him that it wasn't his responsibility to correct his parents, but it was my responsibility to stand up for what was right. He looked at me directly and said that his parents had changed since his grandfather passed away, or maybe he had just never noticed it before. He added that all they seemed to talk about now was money, my money in particular. I asked him what he meant. Daniel hesitated, then explained that the previous week he had overheard them talking about my house. He said his father mentioned that it was too large for one person and that they could help me downsize. The kettle began to whistle, giving me a moment to take in what he had said. As I poured the hot water over the tea bags, I thought about Gregory Caldwell and the addition to Thomas's will. I thought about the name tag, the constant requests for money, and now this clear plan to move me out of my own home. Daniel's voice brought me back to the present as he asked if I was sure I was okay. I set the teapot down and sat across from him, telling him that I was more than okay. I felt like I was finally seeing things clearly for the first time in years. He asked what I meant. I smiled slightly, having made a decision, and said that it simply meant it was time for some changes. As we sat drinking tea, I found myself studying my grandson's face, wondering whether he was truly different from his parents or if the same sense of entitlement was simply hidden, waiting for the right moment to show itself. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I felt a cold clarity replace my grief and loneliness. I would not make any rushed decisions, but I would be watching carefully to see who in my family truly deserved the legacy Thomas had left. 3 days after the wedding, Charles and Diane organized a post-wedding brunch at their country club. I thought about whether I should attend, but curiosity won. I wanted to see if the incident with the name tag had been a one-time mistake or part of a larger pattern. I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club wearing a simple yet elegant cream pantsuit that Thomas had always said made me look regal. As I entered the private dining room, I saw several familiar faces from the wedding, including Laura and her new husband Stephen, Daniel, and other relatives and friends. Charles called out and waved me over to the main table. Diane, dressed in a designer outfit that likely cost more than most people earn in a month, greeted me with an air kiss and commented that I looked nice, though her tone carried a hint of surprise. She showed me to my seat. I sat down and noticed that I had been placed next to Stephen's parents, whom I barely knew, instead of near my grandchildren. The brunch continued pleasantly at first until Diane tapped her glass to get everyone's attention. She thanked everyone for coming and for helping make the wedding so special, then added a special thank you to me for being so generous. All eyes turned toward me. She continued, announcing that I would be funding Laura and Stephen's dream honeymoon to Bali. There was a light round of applause. I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips, because I had made no such commitment. Charles prompted me when I did not respond. I carefully set my cup down and said that this was the first I was hearing about it. An awkward silence spread across the table. Laura looked confused and then embarrassed, while Stephen stared down at his plate. Diane gave a strained laugh and reminded me that we had discussed it the day before, and that I had said I would think about it. I replied that yes, I had said that and I was still thinking. Charles leaned closer and told me not to make a scene, saying they had already told them they could book the trip. At that moment, something inside me finally snapped, like a thread pulled too tight for too long. I said clearly that I did not remember agreeing to pay for a honeymoon to Bali, and reminded them that Stephen's parents had originally planned to cover that expense. Stephen's father shifted uncomfortably and mentioned that there had been some business setbacks. I responded calmly that I understood, as these things happen, but added that it was inappropriate to publicly offer someone else's money without their agreement. The table fell silent. Diane's face flushed red. I suggested that Laura and Stephen might consider a more modest honeymoon, one that suited their own means. Diane reacted sharply, questioning that and bringing up my financial situation, saying everyone knew Thomas had left me more than comfortable. Something in her tone, the entitlement and resentment, made my decision clear. I said firmly that my financial situation was not open for public discussion, and neither were my spending choices. Charles grabbed my arm, his grip tight, telling me to stop because I was embarrassing them. I pulled my arm away and told him that they had embarrassed themselves. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and wished Laura and Stephen happiness, adding that I would be willing to contribute to a reasonable honeymoon, but that I would discuss it with them privately. As I turned to leave, Daniel stood up as well and said he would walk me out. In the lobby, away from everyone else, my composure finally slipped. My hands trembled as I searched for my car keys. Daniel asked gently if I was okay to drive. I nodded, took a deep breath, and said that I was fine, just a little shaken. He told me that I should be proud of myself because it took courage. I looked at my grandson, really looked at him, and in that moment he reminded me so much of Thomas that it made my heart ache. Almost without thinking, I asked if he would like to come over for dinner that evening. Daniel smiled and said that he would like that. Later that night, as we sat in my kitchen sharing a simple meal of roast chicken, I found myself opening up to Daniel about his parents' behavior over the past 3 years, the constant financial demands and the slow erosion of respect. He said he wasn't surprised and admitted he had been watching it happen. After his grandfather died, he explained, it was as if they had started seeing me differently. I finished the thought, saying that they saw me as an ATM. He nodded and said it was only getting worse. He mentioned that the previous week he had overheard them talking about my house again. I asked what they had said. Daniel hesitated, then said they were discussing how to convince me to move into Sunrise Acres, the retirement home. I was stunned. My house was my sanctuary, filled with memories of the life Thomas and I had built together. He added that his father said it would be better for everyone if I downsized, mentioning that the real estate market was strong, and that they could help me get the most out of it. I felt sick. They weren't just after my money, they wanted my home too. I told Daniel there was something I needed to tell him, deciding to trust him with the truth about Thomas's addition to his will. Before I could continue, the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw Charles's car in the driveway. I told Daniel it was his father. His expression hardened, and he said I didn't have to answer. But I was done avoiding everything. I said that it was time to clear the air. I opened the door and saw Charles standing there, his face flushed with anger. He immediately demanded to know what that performance at brunch had been about, pushing past me into the hallway. Then he noticed Daniel and asked what he was doing there. Daniel replied calmly that he was having dinner with his grandmother, something the rest of them might try without asking for money. Charles's face darkened, and he told Daniel to stay out of it, saying this was between him and me. I said firmly that if we were going to have this conversation, Daniel would stay. I added that I was tired of the private manipulation and that everything should be brought out into the open. In that moment, looking at my son's angry face and my grandson's protective stance, I knew we had reached the breaking point. There would be no going back. Charles began pacing the living room like a caged animal, saying he had had enough of my attitude. He mentioned the scene at brunch and accused me of turning Daniel against them. I sat calmly in Thomas's old armchair, my hands folded in my lap, while Daniel stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed, watching his father with a mix of disappointment and determination. I said evenly that no one was turning anyone against anyone, that we were simply acknowledging what had been happening in the family since Thomas died. He demanded to know what exactly that meant. Before I could respond, Daniel spoke, saying that they had been treating me like a bank instead of a person. He mentioned the name tag at the wedding, volunteering me to pay for the honeymoon without asking, and the conversations about selling my house behind my back. Charles accused him of spying. Daniel replied that he had simply been paying attention, something they might want to try. Charles turned back to me, his expression shifting into that softer tone he always used when he wanted something. He said I was misunderstanding everything, and that they were only trying to help me manage my finances wisely, reminding me that I wasn't getting any younger. I interrupted him, saying I was 65, not 95, and that my mind was perfectly sharp and I was more than capable of managing my own affairs. He tried to bring up the inheritance again, but I stopped him, raising my hand and saying that Thomas had left me exactly what he intended, and that his estate was not a family piggy bank. Charles's false smile disappeared, and he asked if I was cutting them off over what he called a stupid joke with the name tag. I said that from now on I would be making my own decisions about my money and my home. If Laura and Stephen wanted a honeymoon in Bali, they could save for it like most young couples do. If he and Diane wanted a bigger house, they could work for it. Charles stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a different language. Then he turned to Daniel and said he wanted to speak to me alone. Daniel said firmly that he was staying. Charles insisted it was family business. Daniel replied that he was family. Something shifted in Charles's expression, a realization. He had always been able to manipulate me when we were alone, using my emotions, my grief for Thomas, and my desire to keep the peace. But with Daniel there, those tactics no longer worked. He snapped that it wasn't over and headed for the door, saying that this was far from finished. After he left, Daniel let out a long breath and said he was sorry. I asked him what he was apologizing for. He said he was sorry for not standing up sooner and for letting them treat me that way. I stood up and hugged him tightly, telling him that he was standing up now, and that was what truly mattered. After Daniel left, I sat alone in the quiet of my home, thinking about Thomas, about the addition to his will, and about the family we had built together. I wondered if we had gone wrong somewhere with Charles, or if that sense of entitlement had always been there and we had simply failed to see it. More importantly, I asked myself what I was going to do next. The answer came slowly, forming in my mind like an image developing. Instead of confronting Charles and Diane directly with the addition to the will, which would only make them change their behavior out of fear rather than genuine respect, I decided I would let them continue revealing who they truly were. At the same time, I would quietly take back control of my life and my independence. The next morning, I called Gregory Caldwell. He answered warmly, saying he had been expecting my call after the wedding. I explained what had happened at the brunch and Charles's visit afterward, then told him I needed to fully understand what Thomas had left in his will, not just that clause but everything. There was a brief pause before he suggested it would be better to discuss it in person, and asked if I could come to his office that afternoon. 3 hours later, I was sitting across from Gregory in his office as he carefully explained the full extent of Thomas's estate. The numbers were overwhelming. He told me that Thomas had built several companies over his lifetime and had sold them at just the right moments. His investments, Gregory explained, had been extremely conservative, which allowed them to remain strong even during economic downturns. I admitted that I had known we were comfortable, but not to that extent. Gregory smiled and said that Thomas had always been private about money. He reminded me that Thomas often said I had married him when he had nothing but potential and an old, worn-out car, and that he never wanted me to become someone who valued status or appearances over substance. I smiled softly, recognizing Thomas's voice in those words. Gregory then returned to the addition in the will, explaining that it was simple but powerful. Any descendant who publicly humiliated me would lose their entire inheritance. He noted that the incident at the wedding would certainly qualify, and the situation at the brunch likely would as well. He reassured me that I did not need to make any immediate decisions, as the clause would remain in effect for the rest of my life. I nodded, then asked what would happen if I wanted to make changes of my own, to my will or to how my assets would be managed. Gregory leaned forward, asking what I had in mind. By the time I left his office, I had a plan. There would be no dramatic confrontations or ultimatums, just a quiet reclaiming of my life and my control. First, I called my old friend Claire, whom I had not seen much since Thomas's passing, and we arranged to meet for lunch the next day. Then I stopped by the community center and picked up information about adult education classes. Thomas had always encouraged my interest in painting, and perhaps it was finally time to pursue it. When I got home, I sat at my computer and began researching small business loans. Daniel had mentioned wanting to open a bookstore after college, but had concerns about the startup costs. Supporting his future felt like a meaningful and worthwhile use of my resources. When my phone rang and I saw that it was Diane, I let it go to voicemail. The old version of me would have answered immediately, worried about what might be wrong or what would be asked next. But that version of me was beginning to fade, replaced by someone who was finally recognizing her own value. Later, when I listened to the message, it was exactly what I expected. Diane spoke about a misunderstanding, insisted that they had always had my best interests at heart, and suggested we meet for dinner to clear the air. She also mentioned the honeymoon again, saying they needed to book soon. I deleted the message without calling back. Instead, I opened my checkbook and wrote a modest wedding gift for Laura and Stephen, enough for a nice honeymoon, though not in Bali. I enclosed it in a card with a warm message wishing them happiness and sealed the envelope. My approach had begun, quiet, firm, and without confrontation. Thomas would have approved. 6 months passed, filled with quiet but meaningful changes. I enrolled in painting classes, reconnected with old friends, and spent more time with Daniel, who visited often. I helped him with the initial funding for his bookstore idea, which was developing beautifully. Meanwhile, Charles and Diane's behavior toward me shifted back and forth between cold distance and attempts to regain access to my finances. When ignoring me did not work, they would reappear with forced warmth and convenient excuses to visit. Eventually, the conversation would always turn toward money, plans for renovations, Laura's desire to buy a home, or concerns about their own future. Each time I politely refused to engage. Not discussing my finances became my standard response, delivered with a calm confidence that grew stronger each time I said it. They did not take it well. Diane's messages became more aggressive, and Charles's calls more demanding. But I had found strength in my silence and in the boundaries I was finally maintaining. Today was my birthday, my 66th, and despite my objections, Daniel had insisted on organizing a small family gathering at my home. He had said it was time they remembered whose house this was, with a grim determination that reminded me very much of Thomas. That morning I spent time in my garden, trimming the roses and finding peace in the simple task. The garden had been another casualty of the past 3 years. I had neglected it while catering to Charles and Diane's demands. Now it was coming back to life just as I was. By mid-afternoon, my home was ready for guests. Daniel arrived early to help with the final preparations. He asked if I was sure I was ready for this while arranging cheese and crackers on a platter. I said I was as ready as I would ever be, smoothing my new dress, a bold red that I would never have chosen before. I added that it was just dinner, though we both knew it was more than that. This would be the first time in months that the entire family would be together under my roof: Charles and Diane, Laura and Stephen, and even a few of Thomas's old friends, including Gregory Caldwell. The doorbell rang precisely at 5. Charles and Diane stood on the porch, their smiles so artificial they almost didn't seem real. Charles wished me a happy birthday as he handed me a bouquet of store-bought flowers. Diane commented that I looked different, her eyes taking in my dress, my styled hair, and the subtle makeup I had applied using techniques from a class at the community center. I thanked them simply and stepped back to let them in. Laura and Stephen arrived shortly after, followed by Gregory and another couple who had been close friends of Thomas and me. I moved through the greetings and small talk with a composure I would not have had 6 months earlier. As we settled into the dining room, I noticed Charles's gaze moving around the house in a way that felt like he was assessing and calculating. Diane's attention kept returning to the new painting on the wall, a landscape I had created myself. She asked if I had redecorated, her tone suggesting she found the changes unsettling. I replied that it was just a few updates and mentioned that I had been taking painting classes. Charles repeated it with surprise, as if it were something unexpected. Daniel spoke up proudly, saying that I was talented and had already sold 2 pieces at the community art fair. Diane looked genuinely confused and questioned why I would need to sell paintings. I smiled and said it wasn't about need but about joy. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken by Stephen asking about the bookstore Daniel was planning to open. Daniel said it was going well and added that, thanks to me, he had finalized the business plan and was now looking at locations. Charles reacted immediately, asking what that meant. Daniel met his gaze and said that I was investing in his bookstore. Charles's voice rose, asking with what money. I answered quietly that it was my money. Charles started to respond but stopped himself, glancing at the other guests. He suggested discussing it privately, but I said there was nothing to discuss. I was making my own financial decisions now. His face darkened and he looked like he wanted to say more, but Laura interrupted with a story about their honeymoon to Cape Cod, the destination they had chosen after receiving my modest gift. The conversation shifted, and the tension eased for a moment. After dinner, as we moved into the living room for coffee and dessert, Diane pulled me aside in the kitchen. She asked what was going on, her voice low and sharp. She brought up the honeymoon, the silence over the past months, and my support of Daniel's plan. I replied calmly that it was not unrealistic and that it was a solid business plan. She insisted that bookstores were not profitable anymore and accused him of using me. I told her that I was supporting my grandson's ambition and that there was a difference. Her eyes narrowed as she said she and Charles had been talking and believed it was time for me to move somewhere more manageable. She mentioned Sunrise Acres again and said that the money from selling this house could help all of us. So there it was, the plan Daniel had overheard, now said openly. I said firmly that the house was not for sale, and that my living arrangements were not open for discussion. Before she could respond, Charles appeared in the doorway and asked if everything was all right. I said everything was fine and picked up the cake I had baked that morning, suggesting we have dessert in the living room. As I began cutting the cake, Charles cleared his throat and said that before we continued, he and Diane had something they wanted to discuss with everyone. My hand paused on the knife. This was not part of the evening. I had planned to say something, but before I could, Charles spoke to the room, saying they had been concerned about my decisions lately. He claimed I was making unwise financial choices, isolating myself and refusing family guidance. A stunned silence fell over the room. He continued, saying it might be time to consider a power of attorney arrangement, for my own protection. Gregory Caldwell slowly set down his coffee cup and pointed out that this was a serious step, asking if there was any real evidence that I was no longer capable. Charles responded that I was giving away money to fund a bookstore in the digital age, as if that alone explained everything, and added that I was refusing to consider reasonable downsizing options. A strange calm settled over me. This moment had been inevitable from the day I started saying no. Gregory observed that I seemed perfectly competent, and that making decisions others disagreed with was not evidence of incapacity. Charles insisted that I had always relied on others for financial decisions, and that now my choices were irrational. I set down the cake knife and said firmly that I was not irrational, not incapable, and not in need of his guidance. He told me to be reasonable. I reminded him that I had been reasonable for 3 years, that I had paid for renovations, vacations, cars, and a wedding. I said I had allowed him to treat me like a walking checkbook instead of his mother, but that it ended now. Charles's face turned dark red as he demanded if this was what I wanted, to humiliate them in front of everyone and make them look like villains. I replied quietly that they had managed that on their own. He lashed out, calling me selfish, and standing so abruptly his chair nearly fell. He said that after everything they had done for me, I was ungrateful. Diane tried to pull him back, aware of how it looked, but he continued, saying that I could not just cut them off and that Thomas would be ashamed of me. At that exact moment, Gregory cleared his throat and said that Thomas had anticipated a situation like this. The silence that followed was absolute. Charles stood frozen as Gregory reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. He explained that Thomas had added a condition to his will shortly before he passed away because he was concerned about how I might be treated. Diane asked what kind of condition it was. Gregory looked to me for permission, and I nodded. He explained that any descendant who publicly humiliated me would lose their entire inheritance. This included disrespect, attempts to control my finances against my wishes, or trying to force me out of my home. Charles immediately protested, saying that was impossible. Gregory calmly confirmed that it was real and added that, as executor, he had been documenting incidents over the past several months. Then he turned to me and asked if I wanted to enforce it. All eyes turned to me. I looked at Charles and Diane, their faces pale with shock, then at Laura, who looked confused and embarrassed, and finally at Daniel, whose expression was steady and supportive. I said that yes, I did. Charles dropped back into his chair, unable to believe it. I said I had never been more serious and listed everything. The name tag at the wedding, the honeymoon announcement at brunch, the constant demands for money, and now the attempt to declare me incapable. I said it all stopped now. Diane whispered about their inheritance. Gregory confirmed that it was forfeited. Laura asked quietly if that was true, and Gregory nodded, saying the condition was very clear. Charles suddenly slammed his fist on the table, saying it was not fair and accusing me of tricking them, claiming I had let them believe the money was simply there for them. I replied quietly that I had never promised anything. They had assumed, taken, and demanded, but never once asked what I needed. Diane then asked about Laura and Stephen, saying they had done nothing wrong. Gregory checked his notes and said that Laura had been present during several incidents but had not actively participated, though she had also not defended me. Laura's eyes filled with tears as she apologized, saying she should have spoken up at the wedding. I reached across the table and took her hand, saying that we all make mistakes and what matters is what we learn from them. Stephen asked what would happen next. Gregory explained that, according to the condition, Charles and Diane's share of Thomas's estate would be redistributed. Charles demanded to know to whom. Gregory said that half would go to me, and the other half would be divided among those who had shown respect and care. All eyes turned to Daniel, who looked genuinely surprised and said he had no idea about any of this. I reassured him and told him that Thomas would have been proud of him. Charles stood again, his face twisted with anger, accusing us of conspiracy and saying he would challenge it in court. Gregory replied calmly that he was free to try, but the condition was legally binding and well supported. Diane then tried to soften her tone, suggesting we could resolve things as a family. I cut her off, saying it was too late for that. Charles demanded if I was really cutting them off after everything. No, Charles. I stood up and faced my son directly, telling him that after everything I had done for him, I was finally standing up for myself, and that there was a difference. The gathering ended not long after. Laura and Stephen left with awkward apologies and promises to call soon, while Charles and Diane stormed out without saying another word. Gregory and the other guests made polite exits, leaving only Daniel and me in the sudden quiet of my home. He asked if I was all right as he helped clear the barely touched dessert plates. I answered that I was more than all right, surprised to realize it was true, and said that I felt free. 1 year later, I stood in the doorway of Chapter 1. The bookstore Daniel had finally opened in a charming converted Victorian house downtown. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, lighting up shelves of carefully selected books and cozy reading corners. A coffee counter, run by Daniel's girlfriend Sophie, served locally roasted coffee and homemade pastries. In the children's section, a mural I had painted stretched across one wall. A whimsical forest filled with hidden animals and tiny fairy houses for young readers to discover. Twice a week, I led story time for neighborhood children, something I never would have imagined doing before. The small apartment upstairs had also been renovated, not for me. I still loved my home filled with memories of Thomas, but for a young writer-in-residence program Daniel had created using part of his inheritance. The bell above the door chimed as Laura walked in, pushing a stroller with her 3-month-old daughter, Tomasa, named after her grandfather. She greeted me warmly and said she hadn't expected to see me there. I told her I was just dropping off some new bookmarks I had painted, then leaned down to admire the baby. Over the past year, Laura and I had slowly rebuilt our relationship. After the initial shock, she had made real efforts to reconnect with me on her own, independent of her parents. Stephen had been a steady influence, encouraging her to think for herself rather than simply follow her mother. Charles and Diane were a different matter. After several unsuccessful attempts to challenge the will, they had moved to Florida, where Charles had taken a job with a former associate. Our contact had been minimal, limited to holiday cards and occasional updates through Laura. I asked if she had heard from them recently. She said her mother had called the previous week, and that the conversation had been the same as always, complaints about their situation and how unfair everything felt. I told her I was sorry. She shook her head and said they had made their choices, and she had made hers. Sophie brought over coffee and fresh scones, smiling at the baby before returning to the counter. Daniel soon joined us, carrying a stack of new books, his face lighting up when he saw us. He said the timing was perfect and began sharing an idea he had been working on: expanding the store's community programs to include literacy tutoring and writing workshops. He explained that it would require reinvesting some of the profits, but he believed it was worth it. I told him I thought it was a wonderful idea. As they discussed the details, I looked around the bright, welcoming bookstore, a place that represented not only Daniel's dream, but a new beginning for all of us. Over the past year, I had rediscovered parts of myself I had long neglected. I had made new friends, continued painting, and even started traveling, first short trips, then a 2-week journey to Italy with a group where I met Claude, a kind widower who now called me every Sunday. I thought about Thomas, knowing he would have approved, not just of the bookstore or my independence, but of the boundaries I had finally learned to set. He had tried to protect me, but in the end I had learned to protect myself. The baby's soft sounds brought me back to the present. This was my family now, not perfect, not complete, but real. We were building something new from what had been broken, and in its own way it was beautiful. Daniel asked for my opinion, drawing me back into the conversation. I looked at my grandson, my granddaughter, and the child who represented our future. I looked at the bookstore that had grown from trust and respect rather than obligation and greed. I smiled and said that this was exactly where we were meant to be. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.